Imagine that you're walking through the forest, enjoying the day. There's birds, there's trees, sunlight, a little light breeze. You're wise enough that you can avoid the poison ivy and the ticks, and you remembered your mosquito spray so you're not getting bit. And it's just a lovely, lovely, lovely walk. And suddenly, you run into a giant wall. Something you cannot possibly ever scale. Something that would take an expert rock climber to climb up. And you know you are never, ever going to get over this barrier. Man, if that's not an allegory for the Christian walk, I don't know what is, because that's what it's like, isn't it? We have this landscape that's God given to us in the Bible. We can read the Bible, we can understand the Bible, we can glean so much information, and there's a couple of rough spots in there, but you know, we get wise and we learn how to deal with them. But then, every once in a while, we have something we cannot answer. And maybe the skeptics are on top of the cliff and they're looking down, laughing at us, saying, Christian, you will never scale this. Christian, this is insurmountable. Christian, this is going to destroy your faith. And well, maybe you try to climb it. Well, if you're not prepared, you might fall and break a leg, or worse, you might get killed. You might lose your faith trying to climb this, what looks like an unclimbable barrier. But what if it can be climbed? What if with enough faith and persistence and diligence and study, we can find an answer to even some of the greatest theological challenges that are out there? Hey, I'm Dr. Rob. This is Biblical Genetics, and on Biblical Genetics, we do not shy away from giant theological challenges. When we run into a wall, we try to conquer it. Sometimes we say, okay, here's several possible answers. Maybe one of them is a good one, maybe one of them is not a good one, but you know, here's several different ways to address the issue. Sometimes we say, no, this absolutely has an answer. This is the answer. You guys are being ridiculous. It was never even a mountain after all, and we can just walk right over it with no problem. But today's episode is going to be on something that is a big deal. This is something that Richard Dawkins featured in his book, The God Delusion. This is something that Talk.Origins has an entire page dedicated to it, saying the Bible's not true because of this. But I'm going to share with you a solution that is logical, that fits Old Testament law, that is probable, and that just makes a lot of sense. But in the solution, I'm not going to say this is the answer. I'm going to say this is a possible answer. And as soon as you say there is a possible answer, in fact, there are several possible answers, the skeptics cannot say the Bible is necessarily wrong, or the Bible absolutely has an error, or the Bible absolutely has this contradiction, because it's not necessarily true that it is a contradiction. It is simply a difficult spot for which we have several possible answers. Now, what are we talking about? We're talking about the genealogies of Jesus Christ that are given to us in the New Testament. There are two completely different genealogies given to us. One of them is in Matthew chapter 1, where Matthew traces from Abraham through King David and all the way through the kings of Judah to when the kingship ends, and then the post-exilic era, all the way up to Joseph, the father of Jesus, or stepfather, the adoptive father of Jesus. And then we have Luke chapter 3, where Luke starts with Jesus and goes backwards all the way to Adam. And there's an overlap area from Abraham to King David are the same names. Okay, great. And it better be, because those names are given to us elsewhere in the Old Testament, so they have to be the same names. But then Luke and Matthew depart from one another. Matthew goes from King David to King Solomon, then to Rehoboam, and at which point the kingdom of Israel and Judah split. But then he follows the kings of Judah all the way through the kingdom of Judah. Then the kingdom ends, they're brought to Babylon, they're restored back into the land, and the leader at that time is a man named Zerubbabel. And then Matthew goes through a list of names that we don't have any other information. Other than the book of Matthew, we have no evidence that those names ever existed, yet he gives these names as if they're real people. Boom, 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 all the way to Joseph. But Luke splits at King David. It doesn't go through Solomon, it goes through Solomon's brother, Nathan. It gives a completely different lineage throughout hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way down to Joseph. Now, we know that the sons of Nathan are alive around the time of the Babylonian exile. They are mentioned. So we know that they're there, and Luke records them, interestingly. But those records are all destroyed in AD 70 when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem. There is no way to rebuild those records. How can Joseph have two different genealogies? A genealogy is a list of father to son to son to son to son, and the names are completely different. Worse, two of the names in the middle are the same. We have Shealtiel, the father of Zerubbabel. Wait a minute. Did Zerubbabel appear in two different lists? It is possible. But Shealtiel and Zerubbabel appeared in two different families? Yeah, it's remotely possible. But then when you go to 1 Chronicles, you have another problem, because Zerubbabel is also listed there, and it's a third different genealogy. It's not the same thing as we see in Matthew, and that's not the same thing as we see in Luke. So not only do we have a problem with the Jesus genealogies, we have a big problem with Zerubbabel's genealogy because we have three different genealogies for him. Oh no. Therefore, Dawkins says the Bible's wrong. Therefore, Talk.origin says the Bible has tons of errors in it and is a classic gigantic error. Is that true? Well, what if I could show you that there's a possible answer to this? Then the Bible doesn't, in fact, have an error. And yet, we can't actually know what the answer is. We just know that there's a possible answer. So let's go through what the Bible actually says. In 1 Chronicles chapter 3, we are treated to a genealogy of the kings of Judah, and it ends in King Jeconiah. Now, Jeconiah was the second to last king of Judah. Three of the sons of Josiah were kings, but not in order. And one of his grandsons, Jeconiah, was king before the last king of Judah, who was Jeconiah's uncle, a son of Josiah. Well, the last king, his sons were killed in front of him. He was blinded. He was brought to Babylon, and he died in Babylon. Two kings before that, king reigned for 3 months. He was taken captive and brought to Egypt and died in Egypt. And then we had another king who reigned for 11 years, and then his son, Jeconiah, became the king. But Jeremiah the prophet talks about Jeconiah. Oh, and it talks about him in very negative terminology. It is quite clear that Jeremiah has cursed Jeconiah. Jeconiah, according to Jeremiah, will never be the father of the Messiah. The Messiah is not going to come through him. He is cursed forever, in very clear, very dramatic language. Now, there are other places where people are cursed in the Bible by God, but then they repent and God forgives them and restores them. Even though the curse was very direct, God is a very forgiving God. So the Jewish people say that Jeconiah repented. Well, he had plenty of time to do it. He was in prison for 37 years. He was king for 3 months, then he's taken away to Babylon. He's 18 years old, thrown into prison for 37 years. When he gets out, he's my age. He's 55 years old when he's out of prison. This is the last surviving king of Judah. What do you think that king is going to do after he gets out of prison? Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And that's going to lead to the solution to the quandary. But it actually gets worse. Because when you look at 1 Chronicles, it goes, the lineage goes from Jeconiah to a man named Pedaiah to Zerubbabel. Who's Pedaiah? Is that the same name as Shealtiel? They don't sound the same. Now, interestingly, a lot of Old Testament people had more than one name. Sometimes the names are not related to one another, but other times they're actually very similar names. Like, Jeconiah, he's also called Coniah. Well, by dropping off the Yahweh in the front, you have Coniah, Jeconiah. Okay, that's easy to explain that, but he's also called Jehoiachin. Is Jehoiachin and Jeconiah the same name? Actually, yeah. Jehoiachin means, may the Lord establish. Jeconiah means, Yahweh has established. It's the same name. So it's possible that Jeconiah had a son named Pedaiah who was also called Shealtiel. Or it's possible that he had more than one son. But both sons can't have the son named Zerubbabel unless something happened. Like imagine that Jeconiah, the king, he's trying to have a bunch of sons, and he has a wife, and together they have Pedaiah. But then Pedaiah dies without an heir. What, according to the Old Testament law, does another brother have to do for Pedaiah? Well, he has to marry the widow and raise up a son in Pedaiah's name. That's called a Levirate marriage. It's something very strongly attested to in the Old Testament. In fact, it says that if a brother is not willing to do that, then let him be accursed. Oh yes, so brothers have to raise up a son in the name of their deceased brother. Now, why is that? I mean, is that fair to the woman? Well, yes, because that means that she still gets to control the inheritance of her husband. It means the brother can't steal all that stuff and leave her poor and with no way of supporting herself. It also means that she can have a son, and the son will inherit her deceased husband's property. The other brother can't usurp it. Now, I know it sounds a little sad and a little gross that the brother says, you have to marry me and we have to have a son. But then again, it's also providing for that woman. So there's a balance there. It's not as simple as it seems in our modern understanding of the way marriage is supposed to work and women's rights and all that. No, there's a good reason for this happening. But if Jeconiah has Pedaiah and Pedaiah dies, one of Pedaiah's brothers would have had to marry the widow. Now, who is Pedaiah's brother? That's an interesting question. Let's go over to Matthew, because Matthew has a different lineage. It doesn't go from Jeconiah to Pedaiah. It goes from Jeconiah to Shealtiel. But in Luke, Shealtiel's father is not Jeconiah. It's Neri. And Neri traces back not to Solomon, but to Nathan, Solomon's brother. So the sons of Nathan are there, and somehow the sons of Nathan get into Jeconiah's lineage. What's going on? Well, here's my possible solution. I thought about this for weeks before it finally dawned on me what might have happened. This is just one of many possible, but this is one definite possible solution. Jeconiah has a wife. Don't know her name. They have Pedaiah. He then marries the widow of Neri, who's also in David's lineage. And Neri and his wife already had a son named Shealtiel. And Jeconiah adopts Shealtiel. If at this point Pedaiah dies, Shealtiel would have to marry his widow and raise up a son in his name. So 1 Chronicles, like Chronicles tends to do, takes a very, very specific, very logical, very following the law, goes Jeconiah, Pedaiah, Zerubbabel. Even though Zerubbabel is not his biological son, he's legally the son of Pedaiah. Okay. But why is Matthew taking a different course? Well, interestingly, what if Matthew's not a genealogy? What if it's not an actual genealogy? What if it's a list of possible kings of Judah, the list of the rightful kings of Judah? Now, we know that Matthew skips over some names. He skips over 4 names in the line between King David and Jeconiah. Jeconiah's father is not even listed in Matthew. We know he skips over a couple of names. And so that word in the King James, begat, in the modern translations like the ESV, the son of, we know that's not technically correct. In fact, the word in Greek is the same root word as Genesis. So Jeconiah is the genesis of Pedaiah, not necessarily the father. We know some of them aren't father to son relationships. So it's interesting. We know he's skipping over a couple, so it might not be talking about strictly biological relationships. Maybe he's talking about these are the people that have the right to the kingship. And that's very important through the intertestamental period. You got like 400 years here after they're restored into Israel where they don't have any kings. They're ruled by the Greeks. They're ruled by the Romans. They're ruled that they don't have their own kings. And yet they still would have known who the rightful king was. I mean, there's a rightful king or maybe queen of Hawaii right now. There are rightful kings and queens of places that don't have kings and queens now, but the families certainly know who the rightful person is. Well, I think that would have been also have been true in the family of Jesus' father, Joseph. We know he's from Bethlehem. We know Bethlehem is King David's lineage. We know he's from King David's lineage. We know that specifically. And Bethlehem's a small town. Everyone would have known, at least in the family itself, who the rightful king should be. And if Matthew is tracing the kingship, then we don't have father to son relationships. Just like if you looked at all the kings and queens of England from the time of William the Conqueror till today, fully half the time the next king or queen is not the child of the previous king or queen. Literally half the time. That is not a genealogy. That list of kings and queens is not a genealogy. In fact, King James, he comes out of the middle of nowhere. What is he, the fourth cousin or something? I don't remember. He's like crazily not related, descended from some ancient person, but not related to the last, to Queen Elizabeth. He's a distant relative. But imagine that you don't have real kings and queens. So if a man who is the king, the rightful king of Judah, lives to a ripe old age, let's say he's like 80 or 90 years old, well, they're going to trace through the family tree and they're going to try to find the next rightful person. But if he's an old man, his brother might be dead already. His brother's son might be dead already. The grandson might be dead already. We might go from a man to his great-grandnephew. We might have skipped over generations. Oh, that alone might explain why Matthew's list is shorter than Luke's list. And we know Matthew is skipping over names, fine, but that is going to have an effect on the number of generations, and Matthew's list should be shorter than Luke's, just because of that reason. But if Matthew is a king list, and if Pedaiah had died, Pedaiah was never the rightful king. It would go from Jeconiah to his adopted son, Shealtiel. That's what Matthew traces. So we have a solution to 1 Chronicles doing one thing and Matthew doing something else. They're both true at the same time. There's not a mistake there. There's not an error. They're both true. Oh. Meanwhile, Luke is, because Luke is the historian, Luke looks like he's really tracing the genealogy, father to son relationships. And so it goes from Solomon's brother Nathan through a long line to a man named Neri who has Shealtiel, who then has Zerubbabel. This also fits Jeremiah's curse. Because if this is true, and any number of possible solutions might be true, but if this particular one is true, there's a break in the genealogy between Jeconiah and Shealtiel. Shealtiel is not his blood descendant. So let him be counted as having no children, Jeremiah said. Yeah, he had no children. And the Messiah is not going to come from him. Well, the Messiah didn't come from him. The kingship came down through him, but the Messiah by blood did not, and yet he's still descended from David, which is critical, because God said the Messiah is going to come from David. It has to come from David. And Luke, for us, traces that line. Wow, that's really cool. But then, from Zerubbabel on, Matthew and Luke they're tracing very different names. They're not the same names at all. In fact, the sons of Zerubbabel in 1 Chronicles are not seen in Matthew or Luke. So maybe he had another son that is not listed in 1 Chronicles, or maybe one of those sons is named by another name, in which case Matthew and Luke make sense. That's another puzzle for biblical students, and I actually don't even quite know the answer to that yet. I know some people have written on this, and I want to dig deeper into it to see if the names are comparable. But you don't have to have a long list of names, no, because the person in 1 Chronicles who cataloged all the descendants of Zerubbabel was going to himself, not to whoever the Messiah might have come through. It was his own personal genealogy, going back through many generations and many steps. So if the first name is the same in two lines, they can split from there. Or maybe the second generation you can find a similar name, then it can split from there. You don't have to have all of the names in Chronicles and Matthew to be the same, or in Luke to be the same. Not necessary at all. It's just that first generation after Zerubbabel. That's what I really want to look at. But then we have, if you're going down through the list here, Zerubbabel in Matthew has a son named Abiud, and in Luke has a son named Risa. And then you have 6 generations down from Abiud in Matthew, you have a man named Eleazar, who has a son named Mathan. In Luke, you have 14 generations down to a man named Levi, who has a son named Mathat. That's really curious, because Mathan and Mathat are Joseph's grandfathers in both Matthew and Luke. I'm guessing that's the same person. So how can the line split and then come together? Well, all you have to do is any point in that list have a son or have a man who didn't have a son. And then you have to go start looking through the family records to find the next legitimate heir. And that's what Matthew would have recorded. Just like in France, we have this thing called the Capetian miracle. Because Margaret of Valois had 3 brothers. Each one of those brothers served as a king and they all died. Now we have Margaret. And the French are like, we have to have this kingship go on. So Hugh Capet, who is related to her back I don't know, 6 or 10 something generations. It must have been hundreds of years since the Capetian line split from the kingly line. And Hugh Capet married Margaret, and the kingship was restored. Interestingly, the Y chromosome was kept intact in that instance. That's called the Capetian miracle. I think something like that would have happened here between Matthew and Luke, and we can see that when this guy named Mathan just suddenly appears. It's probably that Eleazar didn't have a son, so we go back up the family tree. We could jump over to the other lineage at any point. We come back down, and we have Levi, the father of Mathan/Mathat, the father of Jacob, and Heli. Jacob is mentioned in Matthew, Heli is mentioned in Luke. How come Joseph have 2 different fathers? Well, I'm suggesting that Jacob didn't have any sons. And Heli died before Jacob, so Joseph, Jacob's nephew, became the rightful king of Judah. And therefore Jesus Christ, Joseph's adopted son, would have inherited that right. Now that has profound implications if that's true, because that means that the people around Jesus would have known that he was the rightful king of Judah. So when Pilate nailed that sign on the top of the cross over Jesus' head, this is the king of the Jews, because people were saying he was the king of the Jews, because he actually was the rightful king. But it also means that, you know how a lot of people say that Joseph must have been a really old man. He must have died, married a young Mary, and he was old, because he's not seen in the rest of the Gospels after the birth narratives. Oh, he does appear one time later on. But Joseph kind of disappears. So everyone says, oh, he must have died. He must have been an old man, which is not said. It's not stated. Early church tradition says that Joseph had a whole bunch of other sons. The Catholics have picked up on that and said, oh yes, you see, Mary never did anything with Joseph ever. She remained a virgin the rest of her life because, I guess Joseph wasn't functional or something, but he had other sons and daughters that are mentioned in the Bible. Except that if Jesus is the rightful king of Judah, then he has to be Joseph's oldest son. So the other brothers he has and the sisters he has must be Joseph and Mary's children that are younger than Jesus. Oh. So then James, brother of Jesus, and Jude, who wrote the book of Jude, the brother of Jesus, they would have known that Jesus was the rightful king. Oh, that's very, very interesting. Now, that's not the most common thing you hear today. Most people, when faced with this at first, say, oh, well, this is very easy to answer. Matthew is tracing Joseph's lineage, and Luke is tracing Mary's lineage. And that is a very common thing today that is not common in ancient history. Most people in ancient history, not all of them, all the way back in 200-300 AD, some of the church fathers suggested the formula I just said, that Matthew's going to Joseph and Luke is going to Mary. But most scholars said that Matthew is tracing the kingship. But I've never seen anyone reconstruct a possible family tree like I just did. And this family tree is now published in our Journal of Creation. If you would like to see this or read this more deeply, well, you have to subscribe to the Journal of Creation or wait a couple years until it comes out behind the paywall. But it's there for you. I will have the family tree. So if you click on the link in the video or the podcast description, it'll bring you to that page on my website that has this episode, and in the notes there will be probably a low-res version of the family tree for you to look at. Now, I know this is a huge area of debate, not only between the skeptics and the Christians, but also within Christianity itself, because most people today hold that formula that Matthew's tracing Joseph and Luke is tracing Mary, except Mary's not mentioned in Luke. She's mentioned in Matthew. Oh, that's interesting. But consider this. Within the kingly lineage, you would expect a lot of marriages between close relatives. In fact, you'd expect a lot of first cousin marriages. I mean, they're common enough in the population anyway at this time, but that kingly line, you'd see a lot of intermarriages between descendants of David. So it's actually quite likely that Matthew and Luke are both tracing Mary, and they're both tracing Joseph, because it's likely that Mary and Joseph were cousins, maybe second cousins, but quite possibly cousins. Some people suggest that when Heli didn't have a son, he had Mary, and Jacob had Joseph, and so the two cousins, the son of Jacob and the daughter of Heli, got married. Okay, that's a possibility. I don't think so, though. I think that Heli actually is Joseph's physical father, and that he inherited the right of the kingship from Jacob after Jacob died. But that's a long story. I just threw a lot of names at you. This has been a long episode. But what I wanted to show you is that there's a possible solution to this. We don't have to be afraid when we run into a part of the Bible that's difficult. We can say, okay, what's the question? The question is, why are there two different genealogies in the Bible? What are the possible answers? Well, Mary versus Joseph is one, or Matthew being a king list and Joseph being the genealogy is another. So there's two possible solutions right there. There's no necessarily an error here. And it's exciting, because all of a sudden we can relax. There's multiple possible answers to something that the skeptic is saying is an error in the Bible, and it just isn't so. There's something else I forgot to say earlier, something very important, and that is this. Before the Bible is actually compiled, before the New Testament comes into what we now call the New Testament, there's a bunch of books circulating, and some of the ancient peoples are arguing over which book we should include and which one we should include. That's another long story for another day. But very, very early, the four Gospels were circulating as a set. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were together in one book. A long time before we got the books of the New Testament settled down. The Gospels were a set. Very strong evidence, I'm going to say we now know or we believe, but there's very strong evidence that Mark came first, and Matthew was based on Mark, and Luke was based on Mark, but independently. So Mark doesn't have the genealogy. Matthew added one and Luke added one and added them differently, but then the early church put those books together. And no one ever fiddled with it. No one ever tried to take the genealogies and change them to make them the same. No, they accepted them. They're both the Bible. They're both true. They put them together. So early on, those people knew something we don't know. Now, several centuries later, we see the church fathers wrestling with this, and they're coming up with several possible solutions. And actually, the same as the two modern solutions, those are the old ones also. But they didn't know. Something was lost in transmission between the compilation of Matthew and Luke, their acceptance as being true, as being accurate, as being authoritative, and putting them together, the people are assuming that they didn't have a contradiction, even though they had different name lists. I'm kind of guessing that anyone reading Matthew back then would have known that Matthew was establishing the right of Jesus Christ to be the King of Judah. But Luke was establishing the fact that Jesus Christ was descended from Adam, and therefore he can be the propitiation for the entire world. That's a really easy thing to imagine. Is that true? Add something in the comments section. I'd like to hear what you think. But that's it for now. Thank you for listening to my long soliloquy. I've been working on this for months. I've been waiting for this paper to finally come out, and now it is. Now I can finally talk about it in public. This has been a lot of work, a huge amount of work. Even getting to this location where this cliff is, it was a 2-hour drive from my house, and I had to drive up a mountain and hike into the woods. I'm getting mosquito bit and whatever, but I'm doing this for you. I'm doing this because I love supporting the Bible, and I love encouraging people. And the comments that I get from my supporters are wonderful, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much for giving me some nice comments. I know I get some negative ones from the skeptics, but I can just ignore those because I know that I'm helping some people, and hopefully this is a help, because Richard Dawkins is wrong. And talk.origins, they're going to have to take down that page because there's not a mistake in the Bible, period. Hey, if you'd like to help support biblical genetics, there'll be some links in the show notes. Thank you to all the people who are helping me get this show out there to the masses.